Welcome to Work from the Inside Out, a podcast that highlights real-life stories, practical strategies, and best practices for transitioning your career from unhappiness and dissatisfaction to fulfillment, meaning, and joy. Now here is your host, career and executive coach, Tammy Guler-Loeb.
Hey everybody. I am so delighted to introduce my guest today, Dr. Nicole Byers. Nicole is a neuropsychologist, speaker, host of the Bold Life podcast, and CEO of Rocky Mountain Neurosciences in Calgary, Canada. She has a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Saskatchewan. She is an adjunct research assistant professor with the University of Calgary, and she has published articles in professional journals on the topics of brain health and neuroscience. She helps recovering perfectionists and high achievers get out of the cycle of overwhelming to-do lists, procrastination, and self-doubt so they can achieve their goals without burning out. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicole Byers. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to have you. I think there's a lot of people listening who are going to want to hear what you have to say and what you've uncovered over the years that you've been doing this work. But before we get there, we like to start at the beginning on Work from the Inside Out and talk about some of your formative years or your earlier years. So take us back there and tell us how they may or may not have informed where you are today.
Yeah, great question. So I'm originally from Canada, from a province called Alberta, grew up just outside a pretty major city, close enough that we were basically like a suburb. So I didn't really grow up rural, but pretty close to a major center. I grew up in a math family, a family that valued education. My mom's an accountant. My dad is a chemical engineer. And so I think something that really, impacted some of my career path was that early focus on the value of education, focus on science, focus on kind of hard work and what it means to be successful.
And so successful being through having an education and developing, it sounds like, some kind of expertise or depth of knowledge in a particular discipline or area.
Yeah, for sure. I remember, back when I was in high school and some of my friends getting, high school graduation gifts from their family. And we celebrated my high school graduation, but it was never the end, right? That was always the plan was that, of course you're going to go to university. Yeah. Of course you go on from there. And kind of the hiccup in my road to university was when I was in grade 12, early in the year, right when we were applying to university, our school system went on strike for almost a month.
Oh, wow.
So we didn't have, guidance counselors available. We didn't have anyone there to kind of help us with that process. And so we were left to kind of flounder and figure it out ourselves. And so really when I went into university, which I got accepted, which is fantastic. And I kind of started with no clue what I wanted to do. Engineering and math would have been the easy options. Right.
Sure.
That's what my family.
That's what you were introduced to, right?
Yeah, for sure. And at least here at the time, there were a lot of scholarships available for women in engineering. It was something they were really promoting. And then I had, family alumni in that area too. But I like math. I like numbers, but it never really felt right to me, not exactly what I wanted to do. And so I spent the first couple of years not really knowing what I wanted to do. I went into science, a general program, took a bunch of classes and, hoped I would eventually figure out what I wanted to do with my life.
I'm curious, since you had, these parents who were, sounds like very, highly intellectual, academic, very focused. Were they trying to steer you in a direction, or were they kind of open to allowing you, or I don't say allowing, but were they supportive of you finding your way, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate that they were supportive, but there was always that kind of disclaimer in the background or expectation there, right? Of, okay, this sounds okay, but it's not exactly what we did. So we just want to make sure that you're doing something that's going to work, right? And My parents are from the generation too, where my dad worked for the same company his whole life, right? For 30, 40 years. And so that was kind of the expectation, right? Is you go to university, you get a degree, you get a job for a company, and you stay there the rest of your life. And, things have changed over the past 30 years. That's not quite the path that most of us take anymore.
But it is the model a lot of us had. And even, I think about people in my generation. I'm at the very sort of end of the baby boomer generation. I see a lot of my peers still trying to sort of teach that linear model to their kids as if that's still what works. And then if someone deviates from that, it's like, well, what's wrong with you that you want to make a change? And the fact is, that's really the way of the world now. So I think people are starting to get that. I mean, of varying generations, they understand that gone are the days of, getting that degree and jumping into, sort of that entry level place and then following some sort of progression. I mean, there are certain careers in which that may still be true, but I'd say for a preponderance of careers, that is no longer the case. And I think people do feel freer now to also change their minds and go in other directions. So you started, in college or university, you started in the sciences, not really being sure, but must have had some inkling that was a place that you might find something. Did something grab you there?
Probably not initially.
No.
I think it was,
Okay.
I went in the first couple of years. I still actually, as you said, I ended up pursuing psychology, and I can talk about that, but I didn't like my introductory to psychology class at all. I didn't find it
funny?
Interesting. Yeah. I got through it and I was like, well, that wasn't right. Right. And actually what changed my mind and what got me more interested in psychology is in my third year in university, I kind of was starting to figure out what I was doing. I took an elective called Introduction to Human Neuropsychology, where I had a wonderful professor who ended up becoming a mentor for me for a number of years. And how she would run the class is each day she would come in and she would tell a story or a case study, a famous neuroscience case study of how things can go wrong with our brains and how our brains work or don't work so well after they've had some type of injury. And it really grabbed my attention. These were super cool studies. She was a wonderful teacher, which I think helped to pique our interest. And she was a great storyteller. And so that really got me interested in, what is this neuropsychology thing? And then I followed her around for a few years as an undergrad, volunteering in her lab and trying to convince her to mentor me for graduate school. And thankfully I was able to eventually.
So did you end up working with her for grad school? Did you go on to grad school right from undergrad or?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So I ended up working with her. Actually, I didn't strong arm her, but I used all of my convincing skills to convince her not to retire when she was planning to, because she was going to actually retire her student before me was supposed to be her last student. And then I managed to finagle my own spot in there. So she stuck around for a few more years to support me through grad school, which was fantastic.
That's amazing. But I think you're also pointing to something here that I think is critical. And hopefully this connection will make sense. But it sounds like she created an environment in the classroom that really was engaging, with storytelling. And while the subject matter sounds like it was interesting to you, it's the sort of culture and climate that she created in the classroom that really made the difference. I can imagine if you took that same course with a different professor who taught it like right out of a textbook, here's the information, take a test. Here's the information, take a test. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, whether you think you would still found that as fascinating or would have gone in that direction. I mean, it's hard to know, right? But
yeah, but I can say probably not, right?
Yeah.
Like I said, I didn't like my first couple of psychology classes. I found them a little bit dry and boring, and it wasn't super engaging for me. And, I know there are always those teachers that you remember, right? The one, even though I'm a type A overachiever. I love school. I love learning. So school, it's always fun for me most of the time. There are still those ones that stand out, right? That, like you said, kind of bring the subject matter to life. They're so passionate about what they do. You know that they're interested in it too. And it makes you want to be interested and learn more as well.
It makes me think about when people go to work and they start to either get restless or even become downright unhappy at work. And when you really unpack what's going on there, I say this as a coach, I often find out that it's actually not the work itself that's troubling them. It's often the culture, the climate in which they're working, the relationships, oftentimes the leadership or the boss they're working under, that they're not feeling either inspired by or appreciated by, or they're not learning or growing. And I'm sort of relating it to your experience in that classroom, that you were engaged in a certain way. And I'm not saying that we need to be in jobs where we feel entertained. It's not entertainment, but it is engagement, right? And feeling like you're learning in a certain way that really does allow you to take the information and assimilate it in a way that really you can do something with it. And I think that applies in a certain way to what helps people to be happy at work. And I just thought of that in that moment as you were talking about that.
That's a great point. I totally agree. I know something for me that I've learned about myself over the past few years is a value that I have that's really important for me in my life is lifelong learning. I always want to feel that I'm learning and growing. And when I have made pivots, as an adult now in my career, it's because I felt just like that, right? It wasn't necessarily that I didn't like what I was doing. It's that I started to feel stuck. I felt like I wasn't moving forward. I wasn't growing as a person, and I wanted to pivot.
Yeah. I hear that all the time. And I think some of us probably have more of get that sort of itch to learn in different ways. It's not the same for everyone, but I find that most people definitely feel better when they've learned something new or done something a little different. It doesn't have to be dramatic for some people. So you convinced your professor, your mentor, to delay her retirement. Till what point? I know you have a PhD in clinical psychology. Did you go right out of undergrad into the master's and then also the PhD? Was that all sort of one pathway?
Yeah, that's right. I never took a break. I went right from high school to undergraduate school and then to graduate school all the way through, which, the stars just kind of aligned for me and that it worked out and I didn't have to take any time off and, kind of kept that motivation and momentum for me at the time.
So in terms of that trajectory, what kinds of things did you become interested in as you went along? I know you have your bachelor's in psychology. How did your interests develop over that time? And how much time did that take between finishing your bachelor's and then completing your doctorate?
Yeah. So I was in graduate school for 6 years. Is that right? I was in university for 11 years. So that must make sense, right? So how it works here is, we do an undergraduate degree and then we go to graduate school. And part of our PhD program at the very end, we do a 1-year residency in a hospital. So that's part of my graduate training too. I started graduate school. I was still working in the same lab with this mentor. So she ran a lab focused on aging. It was actually a rural clinic. I went to graduate school in Saskatchewan, which is a pretty rural province here in Canada. And so folks outside the major centers don't always have access to healthcare, especially specialty healthcare like neurology and neuropsychology. And so they ran a clinic where folks would come from, 5, 6, 7 hours away for a whole day assessment. There was an interdisciplinary team, and the goal was to help diagnose possible dementia like Alzheimer's disease. For example, folks that were struggling in their older years with memory or concentration or problem solving or speech. And so my interest really early on was on dementia and aging. And that's what I did most of my research in that area and most of my training. And then when I did my residency, they like us to get more of a broad training that year. So I did have some additional experiences there, which looking at the time, I was not super happy that they made me take these extra electives and do these things. I was like, I know what I want to do with my life, but I'm glad I did. Now, I think a lot of those skills that I learned from having that breadth of experience from working in different clinics with different patient populations have really helped me in my, current role and where I went from there.
So tell us a little bit more about that in terms of, at the time you were probably like, hey, I've got this, I figured it out finally. Don't make me do all these other things.
Yeah.
But now you're saying, it really was helpful to dip a toe in these other, waters. What would you say the benefits of that were? What kinds of things have you been able to take forward with you? Because I think sometimes we look back or we think, well, it's taken me this long to get to this point. And some people look back on their past and they think, oh, I did all these other things. It's like, but everything you've done till this point has added up. And I think this is the point you're making. It all added up to where you are now. So what were all those different things that you did that at the time maybe you weren't quite as enamored with, but you can see now the value in them?
Mm-hmm. Or even at the time, like you said, I just didn't realize the value or how it might impact my career later on. For example, one of the rotations I did was in a clinic focused on health behavior change. So for individuals who were struggling with less healthy behaviors, like wanted to quit smoking, for example, wanted to start exercising regularly. We did some work in a diabetes clinic with folks who were struggling to manage their diabetes and weren't taking their insulin regularly or checking their blood sugar regularly. And I had another really great mentor. I've been very fortunate throughout my career to have some wonderful mentors. And the psychologist I was working with really helped me understand some of the barriers that we have to changing anything in our lives, why our brains resist change, why we throw up all of these roadblocks when even if I know at one level, these are all really healthy for me and I should do these things, why I don't do these things and helping to overcome that resistance. So, from a clinical perspective, that was really helpful. And I think it's always been helpful for me to see different perspectives and to see different ways of understanding the world, understanding our health, understanding our well-being, and just being exposed to those different perspectives. Even if at the time it's not necessarily something I take, I know it's there in the back of my mind. There is another way of doing things. If this way I'm doing things doesn't work, maybe I can pull from these other resources.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I think sometimes we get stuck, especially when something isn't working and we get stuck and we think, well, I've been around the block a few times. What's wrong here? And yet if we just pick up our heads a little bit and look around, usually we can either source something from our past or maybe even ask another person what they think. And we can get some other ideas out, from that. And it just gets us unstuck in our thinking and we can move forward from there. But I can really appreciate that. Were there other rotations during that time that you recall that were, that you look back on now and say, that really was helpful or that was interesting?
Yeah. So there were another great benefit of having multiple mentors and multiple rotations is I got to see different leadership perspectives too. And there were some mentors I worked really well with and some that I didn't. They just didn't have a style that fit for me. Sometimes I felt perhaps a little bit micromanaged or we've all been there before, right? And I think that was really helpful for me too. Even in the moment, it was really frustrating. And I remember not being super happy and having a lot of those days where I was like, oh my gosh, this is not working. Like, why can't I figure this out? But at least it gave me some perspective on, okay, here's how I want to show up as a leader. When I eventually am supervising students or staff, here are the things that I want to make sure they feel. I don't want them to feel this way in our relationship. Here's how I want them to feel at work. And that was really helpful for me.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. I like, those kinds of reflections can really make a difference, not only in terms of what you don't want for yourself, but how you want to be there for others. And yet knowing that their styles may be different. They may need different things than you needed at the time, but it gives you something to bounce off of. So once you got through your residency, then you kind of checked off all the boxes, so to speak. And I realized that that makes it sound so simple. I mean, you were at this for 11 years. But, even so, you must have had quite a variety of experiences over that time. You weren't just doing research. You had an opportunity to have, that direct experience with patients and with people, and in a number of different work environments, it sounds like. So once you completed your doctorate, what was the next step for you?
Yeah, so I got a little bit lucky, fortunate. All the stars aligned for me. Again, I had the woman who was a resident before me, I had kept in touch with. She'd gotten a job back in Alberta. So I went way over to the East Coast to do my residency in the Maritimes in a city called Halifax. I went other side of Canada. And then this woman that I knew, she'd gotten a job in Alberta, which is where my family is from. And she was leaving her job. And she reached out to me and said, there's this full-time job coming up in the hospital. It was a brand new hospital. Are you looking for a job when you graduate? I can put in a good word for you, basically. So she, again, kind of paved my way to getting the job. I got my dream job. I started working on a hospital neuroscience team close to home. And I did that for a few years.
Wow. So what is that for those of us who are more lay people, although I do have a background in psychology, what does that mean to work in a hospital neuroscience unit, I guess?
Yeah. So here in Canada, we have a largely public health care system. And so a little bit different than other places in the world. Yes.
Like the US.
Yes. University is different as well. We have much cheaper education here. We get much more affordable healthcare because we pay a lot higher taxes, but it comes around in the end.
I say that to some of my friends too, who live in other countries, and they say, well, we don't have to pay for this. I was like, yeah, tell me how much you're paying in taxes now.
Yes. It just comes out of a different pocket.
Along the way, we're all paying for things, but anyway, it does feel different when you know that you have access to certain things without having to make that monetary decision in the moment. So this was a public hospital.
Yes. So a public hospital. So I was working, on a neuroscience team. So mostly in what's called an outpatient clinic. So that's folks who are not admitted to the hospital, but they need to come in for specialty services. So they need to come in to see a neurologist. They need to come in to see the team who has a background in neuroscience, like myself. I was doing mostly what's called cognitive assessment, which means I was working with folks who were struggling with memory, concentration, problem solving, speech skills, again, evaluating their skills, helping the team figure out, what's going on for them if they were struggling day to day, how any areas that they were having weakness might impact their work performance, if we need to set up accommodations for them, if they're not able to work anymore, what supports do they need in the community, and helping their families as well manage that. So really, team-focused environment, working with multiple disciplines. We had social workers and physiotherapists and occupational therapists all on the team working together.
Wow. So you did that for several years.
Yeah. So I was there for about 5 years or so.
Okay. And then you decided to make a move from there, or?
Yeah, it was another one of those periods of growing discontent and feeling like I'm not quite in the right place.
Well, I would imagine if you were doing mostly assessments and making recommendations, you weren't developing any kind of long-term relationships with the patients. You were seeing people, assessing them, and then they were moving on to other services. Would I be right about that?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. A little bit of treatment, a little bit of follow-up, but not a lot. That's for sure. And I think, again, what really got me antsy about moving on to something else was I started to feel stuck again because it's public healthcare. We're unionized as well in the hospital. And so there you move up the steps and then you get to a certain point and you've kind of maxed as far as you can go. You get a little bit more money every year, but there aren't a lot of extra opportunities for advancement. Because it's a public healthcare system, there are expectations about how we spend our time. It's really a big bureaucracy, healthcare, right? And so there's quotas still for how many patients we should be seeing, how much time we should be spending. And I was starting to feel a little bit, it's a very big healthcare system here in Alberta, the way it works, a little bit like a number, and that I didn't really have anywhere to go unless I made another opportunity for myself.
So,
love my team, love my patients,
yeah.
just the system wasn't working for me anymore.
So, did you have ideas at that point about what kind of growth you wanted to experience?
Not really. Again,
Mhm.
I was a little bit stumped. Thankfully, again, I had some great colleagues that were supportive. So I had another colleague that had done some private practice work before. So we're a largely public healthcare system, but there are some private options for certain aspects of healthcare. It's a little bit complicated here in Canada and depending where you live. But I had a colleague who had done that. And so she was looking at doing some more private work. And so I, had her a little bit as a mentor and then spoke with some other psychologists in the community who were doing that, including actually my psychologist mentor that I mentioned on residency that was working outside of where I normally work in a different area, but he did a lot of private work as well. And so I reached out to him to ask kind of some advice and recommendations on where to go next.
Wow. So this is for the people listening, this is the epitome of how people move from one thing to the next. First, you recognized that you were getting restless, that you were, kind of itching to grow, and yet you still needed further clarification about what direction you wanted to go in. And you knew that some of your options might be limited given the way the healthcare system works in your country. And yet you knew other people who were doing things differently, but you needed more information. And you started to reach out to your network and get that information. And it sounds like you had some key conversations with various colleagues who were able to help fill in some of those blanks.
Yes, absolutely. Some that, gave me some reassurance that it was okay to do that. That was a little bit of a kind of an internal roadblock that I hit, is that because of, again, the way that healthcare works here in Canada, kind of the expectations that we're taught are, you went to a government funded, largely university where your tuition was subsidized by the general public. The expectation is then that you either get a job in a hospital or you work in a university where you can give back to the community, give back to the country that really supported you, which is a fantastic idea and notion. And then there's a little bit of resistance to, at least in the training model that I came from, to pursuing other opportunities, to pursuing private practice, to leaving those kind of more traditional roles in the workplace. Again, I think some of that's generational, given that our mentors would have been from a generation where that was the option. Right. But that was something that I think I even just needed the reassurance that this was okay and that there was nothing wrong with me wanting to pursue something different. And that in fact, it would open up other opportunities for me to be of service and to help our community just in a different way.
Right. I can imagine. So where did that land you at that point?
Yeah. So I opened up. So first I juggled both jobs. I was still working full time in the hospital. I was using my vacation days to start my private practice, working a lot of evenings and weekends. Then I eventually went down to part-time at the hospital. And then when I felt comfortable being able to kind of leave that role, I went full-time into private practice. And so I had, set up my own private clinic where I was doing really similar work actually to what I was doing in the hospital, just in a different context rather than through the public healthcare system. I was working mostly with insurance companies, workers' compensation board, and a lot of accident and litigation related work as well.
I see. So it wasn't just people paying you directly out of pocket. They had other resources and other means by which, and other systems actually, that they were using. So it wasn't just, this is only for the, top 1%. There were a variety of people that you were able to serve that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just like you said, different model, different system, different pathways to learn and navigate. And again, thankfully, I was really fortunate to have some folks who had paved the way for me and gave me a lot of really great advice on tips and how to navigate this, because we weren't necessarily taught that part in school, right? Wasn't taught how to run a business or how to take insurance because we don't do it, right?
Right. Well, and honestly, I think that's true with a lot of practices like this, that you don't learn the business side of things, regardless, even here in the US, even though more people are doing it as a business, that it's rare that's taught in any extensive way. And so people do become specialists but they don't become business people.
Mhm.
And so it really does require a whole nother learning curve. Good thing you're a lifelong learner, right?
Yes, for sure.
And so I'm curious the sort of the trajectory and what that was like for you. And I really admire that you kind of sort of scaffolded your transition in that way, because I think some people imagine that, well, you just went from one thing to the next, like you flipped, but you did it in a really smart way. You didn't just throw out one thing and go to the other. You tested the waters. And then when it looked like it was beginning to pick up, you were able to get the part-time hours at the hospital. I'm curious how that went for you going part-time at the hospital. I assume people knew that you were starting to work more on the private side. Were people still nice to you at the hospital while you were going private, or
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Again, I got really lucky there that my team was wonderful and very supportive there. And at the time, there were a number of people in our department working part-time and doing that. So it wasn't entirely out of the blue either. The hard part I found was that it could be the nature of the job, but it could be my own internal expectations. But even though I was working part-time, I still felt like there was some pressure to keep up the workload. And so I felt like I was doing a lot more on the days I was there, because I didn't have, it's like, I'm only here 3 days. Like, I have to get all of this work done. And so I felt like it didn't necessarily relieve a lot of that pressure and a lot of that to-do list going down to part-time work.
Yeah, I know that. I think oftentimes part-time work is a little, it's a little tricky. It's a little sneaky. It's not really as part-time as we all think. I did the same thing when I started my business. I worked part-time for several years in a regular, job, so to speak, and then built up my practice. I'm curious about the period of time that you spent kind of making that transition from a full-time role in the hospital to then going full-time on your own. What time frame did that take for you?
That is a good question. I want to say about 1.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Probably.
That's actually pretty fast, actually.
Yeah, it was. And again, I think it was because I was starting to burn out, unfortunately, because I was still doing so much everywhere. And I had, my daughter was born shortly before I started this entrepreneurial venture. So I had a young toddler at home, and I was working a lot still. And I was realizing pretty quickly that I needed to get this up and moving fast, because this wasn't sustainable in the long run. And there was almost a year where I didn't have a real vacation, right? Where all my vacation days were still working, all my evenings and weekends were working. And I was like, this is not going to last.
Yeah. And as joyful as it is to bring a young life into the world, it's a ton of work also. So, yeah. Oh, and by the way, I had a baby in the middle of all that.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. Which was good. That worked out well for me too. We have really good parental leave here in Canada. So I was still employed at the hospital when I had my daughter. And so I had a full 6 months off with her. And then my husband took 6 months off with her, because we both had full-time jobs at the time. And so it was a really great opportunity for me in that respect, that I had that job at the time that allowed me to do that.
That's great. That's terrific.
Unheard of, right? For anyone who doesn't live here. I know.
No, I know. No, that it's very sane is what it is. So then you were full-time in your own practice.
Yeah. So I was full-time in my private practice, still doing the similar work to the hospital, just also having to do businessy stuff on top of that.
Right. And I'm sure there was a learning curve there. I'm curious about, how long ago was that you started doing all of that?
And so I've been full-time in my private practice for 3 years now.
Yeah. All right. So 2019, 2018.
Yeah.
And I was curious about the work itself. I mean, obviously, when you're on your own, I would imagine that you also do work with other people in other disciplines still, if you're still doing some of the same work, that there probably still is some sense of a team somewhere that you work with if you're doing assessments and evaluations and things. But it's clearly not the same as being on a team in a hospital, right? But I'm also curious if there's a difference in the work itself and the kinds of patients you would see, or how the work feels to you being on your own, what that's been like for you, and were there surprises along the way, or has it been what you hoped it would be in terms of your learning curve and things like that?
Mm-hmm. So the team is definitely something I miss. I must say it is just because of the nature of what we do. I do largely now what are called independent medical assessments. And so someone will have had an accident or an injury and their insurance company sends them for that assessment. And so I do my assessment. Other people are doing their assessments too, and I get copies of their reports, but we don't work as much together in that way. It's largely on our own. So I definitely miss having the team and having that support. And the work, yes and no, as to was it what I expected?
Yeah.
I kind of knew what I was getting into going into this, but it's a little bit different because the folks that I work with don't necessarily now want to be there, because they're not coming into the hospital because they're concerned their insurance company is concerned or their employer is concerned. Someone else has sent them for this assessment. And so that has been different to learn how to navigate that relationship. And it's a little bit of a different clinical situation for me with folks who are not that everyone who came into the hospital was super excited to come into the hospital. No one's excited to come into the hospital, but it's a little bit different when your insurance company is making you show up for this.
Right. You have to be there, not want to be there, or not making that choice in the same way. Right.
Yeah.
So, so that's got to make it feel different. And you don't have that same team environment. So where's the growth trajectory for you these days? Because I know that you're also looking at other things in other areas in terms of your practice and what you're trying to put out there into the world. So let's talk about that. Recovering perfectionists, and talking about high achievers and helping people to deal with their overwhelming to-do lists and things. And I also want to mention that you're offering our listeners a gift, a free daily productivity checklist, which people will be able to get at your website, drnicolebyers.com/checklist. We'll have that in the show notes, but I wanted to just make sure people know that they can go look for that.
Thanks.
So tell us how that's developed.
Yeah, great question. So I think like a lot of us, that was another pandemic related pivot in business. Okay. So I went full time in my private practice. Yeah, basically in the summer, fall of 2019. Things were going great. I was super busy. Everything was awesome. And then March of 2020, everything changed. So the types of assessments that I do are not maybe what I'd say medically essential. So it's not urgent care, for example. So it's not something that has to be done. It's like an extra thing that gets to be done. And so there was a period of about 6 weeks where everything in my business just stopped because the referral sources, case managers at insurance companies weren't sure what to do. None of us were sure what to do with COVID, with precautions, with sending folks in for these assessments. Folks were hesitant to come in to a healthcare setting, understandably. And so my business just stopped for 6 weeks. There was just nothing. And so it was, okay, this is the, at the time we thought temporary new reality that would be over pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
But it also made me realize, I've kind of gotten myself in the same place financially where all my income used to be tied to my hospital work. Now all my income is tied to this one type of work that I'm doing. And my business is entirely dependent on me being there. I have to be there. And these referrals continuing to come in from these limited sources, right? And so I started to think about, what else can I add to my business, both for additional revenue streams, but also in this new pandemic and post-pandemic world, what is that going to look like in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to resources? What are we going to do. And something that I'd always been interested in was productivity and how high achieving perfectionists burn ourselves out, like I have done to myself several times throughout my career. Actually, a lot of the clinical work that I was doing at the time as well was working with high achieving, mostly women who were starting to have troubles with their memory. They were forgetting their phone in the fridge. They couldn't remember what they had to do that day. And there was nothing wrong with their brain, but really what they were experiencing was burnout, was this, I've been going for all of these years. My to-do list is a mile long. I am not able to sleep anymore. I'm laying in bed staring at my ceiling because I can't stop thinking about what I wanted to do. I'm feeling that stress in my body. I'm getting more headaches. I'm having stomach problems. I'm not sleeping. Like I said, I'm forgetful. I'm stumbling over my words all the time. And so clinically, I was seeing kind of the consequences of this burnout culture a lot in my private practice. And so I started my podcast during the pandemic. I started working on more online resources, courses, blogs, other, free resources to help high achieving women prevent that burnout cycle, to set up our schedules and our expectations and really care for our minds, bodies, and souls so we can achieve our career goals without getting to that point where we're exhausted and we burn out and we end up in front of the healthcare system because of it.
Right. And would you say that some of the things that you look at are specific to the kinds of things that people went through because of being on things like lockdown or being at home way, way more than what we were used to with, let's say, kids who were also home from school and, trying to homeschool and work a job. And I know I'm an empty nester. So I was watching other people going through this who have school-age children. And it was hard to imagine, what would you do when you're trying to work and you've got kids at home who are doing school on Zoom and it's not working for them. There just seemed to be so many competing priorities at that time. And I can imagine that's an instant formula for burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, the extra workload that a lot of us had to take on during the pandemic and a lot of adjustments that our brains had to make. And our brains aren't really good at doing that. They like things to be consistent. Your brain wants things to be routine and it likes to know what to expect. And our brains are really good at dealing with that uncertainty in the short term. I like to joke that first month of the pandemic, everyone was loving their life, right? They were home, they were making sourdough bread, they were taking up hobbies, like life was good. But as things started to drag on over the first year and then the second year and then into the third year, that caused a lot of long-term stress for our brains and our bodies, which just made that burnout worse because our brains are coping with so much uncertainty. Okay, kids are back in school and they're out of school again. And what am I going to do when they go back? And what am I going to do when I have to go back to the office? And now I have to figure out how to do all this stuff online. And I don't know if we're going to be able to go on vacation. And all of this is just more stuff that our brains have to deal with. So when we're already burnt out, when we're already kind of on that edge of having too much on our plate, it was one extra thing that really caused a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of strain for us.
Yeah. And that contributed to even more issues like things like memory issues and things. I know that a lot of people were complaining about that.
Absolutely. Lots of health concerns. Our brains and our bodies are very connected, right? So when our brain is under stress, our body feels that stress as well. It's like a warning system for our brain. Like, oh my gosh, I'm tense. I can't sleep. I'm in pain. My stomach's upset all the time. That's a warning sign that something is going on, especially when our brains are trying to manage all of that stress. And then unfortunately, as that stress builds, our bodies react more, which just causes more stress for our brains.
Right. And then your body just gets tired. Your brain gets tired. So how do people learn to deal with those? Well, they can listen to your podcast for sure. But when you first sort of started connecting all these dots and realized there's a whole nother world of things here that you can help people with, what were your first thoughts about what you might do about that? Or did you start the podcast right away, or were there other things that you thought about doing?
Yeah, I started the podcast pretty early. And so my goal with the podcast was to share some of these strategies really focused on productivity and time management as a way to counteract burnout, right? Mm-hmm. If we can figure out, what's actually priority in our daily life, not the 4,000 things that we have on our list, because realistically, that's not all going to get done. Right. How do we prioritize? How do we choose where we're focusing our limited time, attention, and energy? And how do we set up our schedules in ways that allow us to do the work and the things that we need to do, but also have a life too, right? To be able to have time to exercise, to eat healthy, to sleep, to spend time with family, to do all of the things. And so I really started as a way to talk about why our brain has learned these expectations in the first place, why kind of our inner perfectionist has developed, our inner people pleaser has developed, why we've learned this hustle culture and these very high expectations we place on ourselves, especially for women right now, men too, but women are really taking the brunt of this, as we know, through the pandemic. Yeah. And what can we do about that? How can we take some action? How can we take control of that to-do list, take control of our time, and feel more confident in that way?
Wow, that's a lot. So, because I thought you were going to say, well, I teach people how to meditate and do all these mindfulness techniques, but it sounds like, I can see where all of that would be, part and parcel to that. But what it sounds like what you're really offering people is a real strategic approach. And as a result of those strategies, people can start to heal more and move forward at the same time. That's the feeling I'm getting. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes back to my early training, right? On this mind-body connection and how we understand health. And that extends to all areas, health in terms of our success in our careers and our success in our lives. And health is not just our physical health. It's so much about us, our mind, body, and spirit. And so I take that approach really into time management, productivity, and success for women.
Oh, I love it. So if people want to learn more about your work or get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, website's probably the best way. It's kind of the center for all of my resources. Like you mentioned, drnicolebyers.com. They can snag that daily productivity checklist that you mentioned on there as well. So that gives a broad overview of some of these topics we've been going through, but also a checklist that I use every day to help me set myself up for success. So how do I get my brain focused in the morning when I sit down at my desk? How do I decide what I'm going to do? How do I structure my day to take advantage of some of these ways our brains are designed to work? So you can work through that checklist as well.
I love it. I love it. And I would imagine that your Bold Life podcast must be an amazing resource as well. So people can look for that. So I want to finish up with one question, and that is, you've made a number of transitions in your career, and you obviously have kept that in mind with different desires in your own life and managing your stress. So if you were to give someone else a piece of key advice about how they can move through a change or a transition if they're considering what's next for them, what would be a key piece of advice you might give them?
I would say find a mentor that's done it before. I know we talked a lot about mentors already, but sometimes it feels like we're the only ones that have come up to this roadblock before. We're the only ones that have gone into this like, oh my gosh, I thought this was my plan for my life, and now I'm at this crossroads and I don't know what to do. And that's not true. There are, how many billion people on the planet? There have been billions of people before us. Someone else has likely gone through a similar experience. And if you don't have a mentor that you can reach out to one-on-one, we can find mentors through things like podcasts, like your show, or books, or other ways to learn from others' experiences.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And not to put you on the spot, but I'm hearing a book here. Is there a book in the works?
Ooh, I would love to. It's on my bucket list.
Okay.
Of things I'll keep you posted.
Pressure.
Okay.
No pressure. Dr. Nicole Byers, the book will be coming, but we don't know when.
To be determined.
I don't know. I hear it. I'm hearing a book in there.
Thank you.
or something, but it does seem like you have a lot of resources and a lot of really great key advice to offer people. So I encourage people to seek you out by your website, by your podcast, access the wonderful checklist you're offering to everyone. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you again for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Nicole Byers. It was so interesting to speak with her, to learn about her journey and current professional endeavors. What is your key takeaway from our interview? If you are interested in any of the resources mentioned in today's podcast, you can find them in the show notes on my website at tammygulerloeb.com/podcast. Just look for episode 198. Are you anticipating your next professional move? Check out my award-winning book, Work from the Inside Out, Break Through 9 Common Obstacles and Design a Career that Fulfills You. It's available in print and ebook editions through my website, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores, or through your local library. If you are inspired by this episode with Nicole, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and please do subscribe so you don't miss next week's show. Remember, subscribing is always free. And if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate reading your written review on Apple Podcasts. It's easy to find through my website at tammygulerloeb.com/podcast. Just click on the Apple Podcasts button and follow the instructions provided there. You can also help sustain the podcast by buying me a cup of coffee at buymeacupofcoffee.com/TammyGL. Since the podcast is self-funded, I always appreciate your support. Thanks for listening, and remember, it's never too late or too impossible to increase your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in your work and other meaningful activities. Let me know how it's going for you. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Work from the Inside Out podcast. For more information, you can find us at www.workfromtheinsideout.com.